Hello, good evening. Hi from London on the hottest day in the history of the UK. And thank you for joining us on the World Product Day. Today is a very special World Product Day because all product tanks around the world are exploring the same theme of product firsts. My name is Elena. I'm one of the product tank organizers in London, and I will be your host tonight. So before we go ahead, let me just give you a few brief words about Product Tank and who we are, just in case you haven't joined our events before. So Product Tank started just as a few friends chatting about product in a pub in London many, many years ago. And by now we have evolved to be the world's largest product community, joined by product people for product people. So we have local communities in more than 200 cities around the world. And they're all focused on helping product people to evolve, to learn, to become better, and share useful content from the mistakes and adventures that we have all gone through. You can get involved in the community as yourself as well. So there are multiple things how you can get involved. So first is you can also speak at a product tank. As I said, we have plenty of product tanks happening around the world. If you're interested, always just get in touch with the product tank organizers in the relevant city. You can also host, just like myself tonight, or sponsor a product tank. You can also write for Mind the Product if you have any specific stories or anything useful that you feel like could help or benefit the community. And you can also become Mind the Product member for even more special content and join a network of other product people. So that's a couple words about Product Tank and who we are, and we'll just get started with the event tonight. So I'm very excited about the lineup because we have rounded up a few very great speakers to share their product first from across different areas. So we will start with Claire. Claire is a staff product manager working in the Cortex Applied AI Research Lab at Twitter. She is passionate about guiding teams to build AI-powered products that people will use, trust, and love. Before social media, Claire worked in health tech, fintech, media, and entertainment. As an AI product specialist and ethicist, she is peer review published on the subject of human-centered explainable artificial intelligence in consumer healthcare apps. And tonight, Claire will talk you through practical advice to consider when getting started with building AI products, all the way from knowing when to actually use AI to solve a problem to making sure you keep it simple even when advanced tech is involved. So I will now pass on to Claire.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for joining me today to talk about building your first AI product. I'm going to assume that you're the kind of awesomely skilled PM that attends Mind the Product and Product Tank, but you haven't had the opportunity to work with machine learning technology before, or you have business stakeholders are saying, hey, you know, this AI thing seems really cool. Maybe we should be including it in our product. And the purpose of this talk today is to really give you an overview of the process that you would go through as you went on that journey, as well as some high-level questions and tips and tricks to help set you on the right path to make sure that you get it right first time. So my first tip to share is that business people tend to say AI and engineers tend to say machine learning. So AI is essentially software that seems to have human-like abilities, whereas machine learning is actually getting a computer program to learn to be able to do things for itself. So try and use the phrase machine learning when you're working with your engineering team. So Alina gave me a little bit of an intro, but I've spent 17 years working in technology to feel comfortable saying that I'm an AI product manager, and I've done a whole bunch of roles in different industries to get to that point. But the important thing for you to know about me tonight is that my undergrad was from performing arts school. And I did go back to university a few years ago to do an MSc at the University of Oxford, but it was in the social sciences. It was not computer science. I cannot code. And so I really want you to take from my bio the confidence that your product management skills are really transferable. And yes, you might need to familiarize yourself with the technology, but your skills are very transferable. And my intention in this talk is to really help you understand the specifics about working with this technology. So I wanted to start by talking about how machine learning fits into the typical product development cycle. So at a very high level, if you're building a product, you are going to find the problem you want to solve for the user or the job to be done. You'll go through an iterative design process, and then eventually you'll MVP or beta, and finally you'll launch. And you'll have some sort of iteration or development cadence from that point onwards, maybe, monthly or quarterly, but it's not going to be very rapid fire. If I layer on machine learning development onto this flow, you'll see that actually it aligns quite well. So once I've defined my job to be done or my problem for the product, I then need to define the machine learning problem that I want the algorithm to solve. Once I have that, the tech team will move to an offline experimentation phase. And this is really trying to build an algorithm which works in an offline dev environment at the level of performance you need to be able to have confidence of putting it into users' hands. You'll then move to online experimentation, and this is actually exposing your users, a subsection of them, to this algorithm to see how it performs. Because I have to say that often online doesn't work the same as offline. User behaviors change, data changes over time, and so you might find yourself moving between these two things before you feel that you are at the stage where you're ready to actually launch the product fully. So yeah, then you'll launch when you're confident. But the important thing about machine learning actually is that it's not just a launch and done type situation. Machine learning models change over time in terms of performance. So as I mentioned, user behaviors change, the data that the model is operating on changes, and we call this model drift. And it's really important that you keep an eye on your model performance and check that you're happy with it. And if you're not, that you have an update cadence, what we call this is a retraining cadence, to make sure that that performance is maintained. If you are working in a really fast-moving business with lots of data, you might actually almost be continuously retraining. If you're in a less kind of frantic business, it might be a slower pace, but it'd be really unusual to have a machine learning model sit in prod for 2 years without being updated. And so this is one thing that you have to be mindful of as a PM, is that actually these are quite high maintenance pieces of technology to put into production. You really have to keep an eye on them. So if this is the overall flow, what are the questions you need to ask as you're moving through the process of building this? Well, I think there are 5. And the questions to ask are, is this problem best solved by machine learning? How will I measure success or failure of the model? Do I have the data that I need to build this algorithm? Should I build or buy the capability to do this task? And what's my user experience vision? So I'm going to go through all of these and again, try and offer you some pointers to help orient yourself through the process. So my first tip when it comes to whether this is a machine learning problem or not is to not over-engineer a solution to a problem. Often problems do not require machine learning to solve them, and you're probably getting the picture that machine learning is quite a heavy investment. So you want to make sure that you're picking the simplest solution for the problem that you're trying to solve. I have this picture of Juicero on my screen because this is a great example of an over-engineered product that didn't serve the job of the customer that it was trying to serve. Ultimately, the product failed, and you don't want to be in that position. So simplest solution first. And what you want to be looking for in terms of good machine learning solvable problems are tasks which are predictable and at scale. So by predictable, I mean you're looking for the same outcome over and over again. And at scale essentially means either you have a lot of data coming in that needs to be analyzed, and it would be very difficult for humans to do that quickly, and or you're doing the same decision over and over again. So you're serving that back out to a lot of people. And those are the kind of tasks that you want to look for. So more specifically, what would that be? It could be something like a classification. So should I recommend this movie to this user? Will they like it? Can I take a picture of a plant and identify it and tell someone how to look after it? It could be tasks which are laborious or boring or repetitive. So first-line customer support is a really great example of this, because often your customer service team are answering the same question over and over again. And this is a real area for automation, because you can actually use an NLP chatbot to communicate with your user instead in that first line of customer support. My other screenshot on here is actually from a company that does artificial intelligence quality assurance for fruit and vegetables. So rather than humans having to pick through lorry loads of oranges, an AI can scan it for quality instead, because it's such a boring and repetitive job. It's very hard to maintain those standards if you're a human. Now, the way I've described good machine learning problems so far, you might think that they're very binary, good or bad, acceptable, not acceptable. But it's actually really good at analyzing continuous streams of data. So things like fraud detection. It's also really great for self-driving cars, because if you think about a car that's self-driving, it has loads of sensors on it, and the computer is getting all of this data coming into it. And essentially trying to make a decision of where to move on a continuum of all the hardware it can operate in order to steer the car itself. So self-driving can be quite good as well. And my other example on this screen is sentiment analysis. So again, this is processing a lot of patterns in data, finding connections and trying to understand the human behavior within it. So those are examples of good machine learning problems. But what would I say are bad machine learning problems? Well, anything which is subjective. If a human can't agree on it, it's very unlikely that a computer is going to be able to. Anything which is a moral judgment, hopefully that's self-explanatory. And anything which is a human issue at heart. So if I had a group of people who were communicating really badly, I wouldn't really want to put a piece of software in between them and force them to interact via that. It would be better to coach them to communicate better. So any kind of human originated issue. And finally, and most controversially, creative problems are bad to be solved with machine learning. And the reason why I say controversial is because actually in recent times, we've seen a real innovation in creation in AI. So this slide on the screen, this is entirely drawn by an AI. It's absolutely fantastic. It's really real. But I would say that in terms of product market fit and what you do with this technology, it's still not entirely, found its niche. And so this would be quite a bold place to start as a PM building your first machine learning product, unless you had a really clear vision of the problem that you're trying to solve. So I'd say for now, creative tests are a little bit fraught with machine learning problems. So let's say you found your machine learning problem. What do you need to do next? Well, you need to define how you're going to measure the success and failure of the algorithm that you built. Because statistically speaking, a machine learning model or algorithm can never be 100% perfect. Just like human beings, machine learning will statistically make a mistake. And the question is, what does acceptable look like to you? So in a medical environment, you would really want to err on the side of caution, and you would want to make sure that, for example, it never missed a diagnosis. In a more fast-moving consumer environment, maybe you have a different weighting of priorities and you have a different definition of what good looks like. And you need to really understand what your limits and tolerances are. Once you've done that, you then need to make sure that all customers will be treated fairly by the algorithm that you're building. So my screenshot here is of a machine learning researcher who proved that biometrics algorithms didn't work as well on darker skin tones as paler skin tones. And you need to be aware of the pitfalls that could happen in your model itself and understand what you will put in place in order to make sure that all of your users have a good and fair experience. Now, as I mentioned, models drift over time. So based on these metrics, how are you then going to check that your model is performing? And on top of all this, you need your standard business metrics that you'd be developing for any other product. It's a lot of thinking, but I really encourage you to do all of this upfront because it will give you a lot of confidence that the thing that you're putting into production is something which is going to be successful. So really invest time in this particular area. So once you've defined this metric, what next? Well, you need to ask, do I have the data that I need in order to build this model? And I'll tell you that acquiring data is your most important responsibility as a machine learning PM, particularly if you're in a smaller company that hasn't done it before. You'll find yourself facilitating and fielding a lot of this activity. And it might be that you work in a company that already has some data available to it that is useful for you, in which case, fantastic. But if you don't, it's not the end of the world. It is possible to buy data. It's also possible that you could build the data collection experience into your current customer journey so that you can capture the things you need. But of course, if any of you on this call have worked with data before, you'll be thinking, hang on a minute, there's a lot to think about data. And there is, and it's mainly to do with your legal obligations. So once you've decided the kind of data you want to capture, make sure that you're engaging your legal team to make sure that you're doing all of this in the right way. Depending on the jurisdiction you're operating in, You will have different responsibilities. You will have data retention responsibilities. And you'll also need to make sure that if you're capturing any data from a user, that they are fully consented and aware to do that for them. And it's really important that you do this because the penalties for not doing this correctly are very substantial. I mentioned success metrics earlier. You want to make sure that you have enough data for the things that you're really worried about. So in the example of the biometric solution, you want to make sure that you have enough data of people with darker skin tones that you can be confident your model is performing before you put it into production. So you want to make sure that you have data for the positive and for the negative. And I can also tell you, you're going to need a lot more data than you think. So just in the way that you might add a little bit of buffer to a delivery date, I would also encourage you to add this to your data budget because you're probably going to need it. And the final thing is that just because you have a bunch of data doesn't mean it's useful to machine learning. In most cases, it actually has to be labeled so that it knows what the data contains and so it can learn what good looks like. And you will need to work with your technical team to design a data labeling strategy. This is a really laborious human task. And so it's better if you can get it right the first time, because if you change your mind, you're going to have to go through and relabel all of it, which can be really tedious. So you will need to go through devising that labeling strategy with your tech team as well. Make sure you're all happy. So the next thing to ask yourself is build or buy, the eternal PM dilemma. Do I build it in-house completely? Do I get a third party to build the machine learning component for me? Or do I just buy a third party product and plug it in? On top of the usual questions you'd be asking yourself with a build or buy decision, the main things you want to pay attention to with machine learning are talent, timescale, and intellectual property. In terms of talent, you've probably heard that machine learning engineers are quite expensive and quite hard to hire. So it might just be that you can't afford to hire these people, and it would be better for you to pay a third-party company to build for you. It's also worth knowing that depending on how technically advanced the thing is that you're trying to develop, a more academic machine learning engineer will expect to publish in academic environments about the work that they've done on your product. And so it's important to understand what their expectations are before you go through that product development journey to avoid any kind of misalignment in terms of what they think they're getting out of the project and what you feel the outcome is going to be. And probably hearing me talk, you are hearing that you can't really build a machine learning algorithm that's custom overnight. It does take quite a lot of time to develop a really robust machine learning algorithm. You're talking months, if not quarters. So if timescale is really important to you and you need something tomorrow, you're probably going to need to buy something that you can plug in more quickly. On the flip side, if you can plug in that solution, probably so can your competitors. And one of the areas that's really important with machine learning is intellectual property. By building that secret sauce, if it works really well in your product, that's a really good defensive strategy for both acquiring and retaining your customers and growing your market share. So also really worth thinking about the IP value of what you build when you're going through that decision-making process. And finally, when you're geeking out so much about the technology, it's really easy to lose sight of what the actual user experience is. And I encourage you to maintain a strong vision of what you think the user experience should be. You might find that your technical teams will encourage you to change the user experience to make it easier for the algorithm to work because it gives them what we call better signal. And I would really caution you to keep the user in mind with this. The example that I'm looping over in this slide, it's MasterCard's Smile to Pay solution. And whenever you see these demos, it's always a beautiful lady. You know, she approaches the screen smiling, she swishes back her lovely hair, and with a frozen smile, she takes a photo. The reality is that in real life, what the algorithm is looking for is a smile in real time. So it wants your face to move from a stationary to a smile because it wants to check that you're there and you're a real person at that moment in time. Now, this might be a kind of experience that you might have done in the comfort of your own home when you can shut the door. You might have been applying for something really high value like a visa or your NHS number. But this is intended to be done at a cash register in front of anyone else who happens to be in the shop. And I have to say, I'm a bit dubious about whether my granny and granddad would be comfortable doing this, let alone most people. So I'm really interested to see whether this experience is adopted. And I encourage you to really think, if you want your customer to keep coming back and using this experience particularly, and they can hire someone else to do this job, just make sure that your user experience is still exemplary, because just because you have great technology doesn't mean that your customer is going to want to use your product. So that was a real whiz through building your first machine learning product. And I hope that I gave you a lot of pointers to orient yourself in terms of how to start and how to avoid some of the common pitfalls. At a really high level, you want to make sure that your problem actually needs machine learning, and then it's the best choice for you. Acquiring data is going to be your most important role as a product manager. Make sure you keep an eye on it. With build or buy, you want to pay close attention to talent, timescale, and intellectual property. Your user experience is still a top priority if you want people to adopt your product. And finally, be really clear on how you're going to measure that your model is good performance for your business environment, and how you're going to monitor that over time. This is really important, and this will set you up well for the long term. So thank you so much for your time today. If you have any follow-up questions, that's my Twitter handle. I don't tweet, but my DMs are open, so feel free to message me. I'd love to chat. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. That was really practical and insightful. Also, I forgot to mention at the start, but as you're joining the talk, you obviously have made the effort to join us in this incredible heat. So please do also ask away any questions you have for Claire or any of the other speakers, and we're going to pick them up at the end at the short Q&A. So moving on, I'm now going to introduce to you James. James is a product leader and serial entrepreneur, having built everything starting from impact social networks all the way to insurance companies. James has worked in San Francisco, New York, and London, helping and working within tech whilst trying to do the right thing for the customer. And today, James will share a product story of what it takes to build a social network for the police. He'll cover off how to run customer interviews in the public sector, what an MVP that's built in 5 days looks like, and how to validate a product that works through behavior before the metrics.
Cool. Thank you, Elena. And lovely to see you all today. So thank you for joining us. As mentioned, I'm going to tell you a product story now. There will be a few things that you can take away from this that come later, but hopefully you enjoy a bit of the journey, and we'll talk through what it was to do my first public sector product effectively, which involved making a social network with the police. And so just for a quick bit about me, as mentioned, I've been doing product for about 15 years now. I kind of masqueraded as an engineer for about 5 of them. Eventually, I got kicked out of engineering into product because I was causing too much trouble. And I've loved it ever since. And, you know, I've helped to build companies that have exited, you know, so $500 million. I have founded businesses. Some have been successful, some have failed, some have been acquired. And these days I like to be on boards or take product leadership positions, but I also really like to mentor companies. So if anything you hear today resonates with you and you want me to come in and lend you a hand, it won't cost you anything. I'm always happy to give back to the community and help us all build great products. So without further ado, and in a number of parts, we're going to talk through a real product story. This really happened, and the real takeaways that came from that journey. So to kind of introduce it, it was a product-led company that had a challenge. And in this case, it's a company called Halo. It's a hyper-local social network. And we roll back to 2019. I was newly minted. It was funded. I was the founder and CEO of this business. And it was a place where neighbors connected. So think of it, if you will, as a kind of WhatsApp for local. So all the little communities and groups you could join, you tuned in. And it was really fun to take part and see what people were passionate about. Like foodie groups across London always took off, and people were sharing what they were eating in restaurants, what they were making at home, swapping recipes. And people used it to kind of build profiles and influence in local areas. So they really kind of like built their community through the conversations they had, not through the posts they made. And even local businesses took part. So you know, it was a London-based company, and when a street was invited, around 1 in 6 homes signed up, and that sort of went to about 250,000 homes, about 1 million people at the height. So it was a really impactful place, but in 2019 it had a problem, and so we were about a year into the journey, and we had focused a lot on how to get our CAC, our customer acquisition cost, down. And we knew that was really important because social networks are quite hungry for money. They don't make money initially. And we really wanted to get to something that could scale quickly. We worked on it. As you can see, that number got down to almost nothing, up from an excruciating more than £20 per user. Retention was looking good, but we had an area that was an issue. So weekly active use, or more specifically, engagement, wasn't going up. Like the curve on the left should be the curve on the right upside down, right? We want a nice hockey stick. We weren't seeing one. And we had a problem. And we did all the classic things that product people should do. So whilst I was CEO, I was the product person in this double-digit number of staff business. We did crazy eights, we did ideation sessions, we interviewed customers, we tried to figure out what it was that could move the dial. And we tried lots of little experiments, but nothing that moved this graph enough. You can see we were improving things, but it's not enough when you're an early stage company. You really have to make something that people love and prove product market fit. And so we tried this for about a month, and we got to a point where I was in a vegan restaurant in Chinatown with my co-founder, the CTO, and he's a man of very, very few words. And halfway through the meal, he kind of looks up at me and he just says, "Why don't you close the deal with the police?" For context, that's kind of like having a whole strategy day where he's done slides on a deck and he's talked it all through, and there's a great takeaway. This was a lot of information coming from him, so I took it very seriously. And so we thought it through, and I got through. And by the end of the meal, I kind of looked him in the eyes and I was like, "I'll do it. I'll do a deal with the police in 30 days. But I had no idea how to do this. It was a great idea. The concept made sense. Local is intrinsically tied to a number of different authorities. The police are a key thing. They're kind of lost in local areas today. So there's an opportunity. But how do you do anything like that? I'd never touched public sector before. And so it comes to part two, which is how can you apply product skills to solve a problem like this really quickly? And so we kind of sat down and I led the team through a series of steps, and we got to a point where we'd identified 3 things we needed to do, or in brackets, I needed to do to make this work. So acquisition. We needed to find access to the police. We needed to find a way to get to them so we could do part 2, where we could understand their problems. What were the pain points of police? We had no idea. And obviously that would lead us to part 3, building something really quickly that could serve that need. Could we create value for the police where they would want to contribute with us? We thought, and we had tried so many things, and we were now betting on this being a thing that would be key to enabling engagement for a hyperlocal social network. And so step 1 was a whole company activity. Everyone should go and tackle acquisition. And like all thrifty startups, we tried a number of different things. And I had a lady in my company called Maria, who ran operations. And after 5 days, she comes back to me and she says, "I've done it. James, the police want to meet you next week in their offices." And I was blown away. And there's a whole growth story around how we solved this problem. But for the sake of focusing on product, we can say, we did it. I was like, okay, let me know where to be and I'll go there. I'll figure out how we can do a deal with the police. And that gets us to step 2, but you need a bit of context here. So this is just an example of the kinds of buildings that the police have in the UK. And the police have sort of 2 types of buildings. They have the big ones with the blue flashing lights, and they're police stations, and they have the kind of unmarked ones. This one in front of you is kind of in the middle. I had to go to one of the unmarked ones. And so we're in 2019, and I go into not the nicest bit of North London, to this big, worn-out red brick building. I stand in front of it, and it looks pretty nice, except all the windows are boarded up. So stood there going, okay, we need to solve this product problem. We've got to do a customer interview, right? We've got to find a way to talk to the police. Bang on the door, nothing happens. So I check my notes. There's a number to call. I call this number. Someone says, "Is it James?" I'm like, "Yeah, coming through the yard." So I'm like, okay, I'll do as I'm told. "What's that?" They're like, "Come around the back." And this big wrought iron rusty gate slides open. Policeman comes out, walks me in. And as I can imagine, most people have never conducted a police customer interview. So for a bit of context, these buildings are kind of like schools. You walk in, it's kind of like the school you grew up in, except all the windows have massive bars through them, and everything seems to be armor plated and a little bit worn out, like people have, used it for hard work. So we're inside this giant sort of building, walking all the way up for a couple of minutes. And then I get put into a room, sit down, there's a desk, there's a screen, and there's a wall with lots of important things pinned to it. And then the guy walks out, closes the door, and locks it. So at this point, I'm obviously going, this is good. Maybe not my best career move. Can't get much worse, right? Got to make it happen. And so I sit down, the door unlocks, and the largest policeman you have ever seen, I think he's the size of the door, walks through, sits down at the table. And it's kind of one of those moments where in your head you think the desk moves. And he sort of sits opposite and says, tell me about Halo. And as many people who do product work and do customer interviews know, sometimes you have to talk to reasonably challenging users. And in this case, we had that moment. So I had to sit opposite someone and run a customer interview. But as part of that process, I think I learned two of the biggest fundamentals in, as a product person, learning valuable things from customers. The first thing is humility. So aside from answering his question, the next thing I was very open about saying is, well, I'll be honest, I don't know anything about how the police works. I'm really, I'm wanting to listen, but you'll have to teach me a bit because I don't understand. And that was a real fundamental in shifting how we had this conversation and how we were going to build this product, because it was going to someone saying, I don't understand. I'm really interested in what you do. Could you talk to me about it? And as a fundamental, that really helps human beings because it acknowledges humility. It's asking for help. And he understood that I wasn't there to sell anything. And that removed a lot of the, not angst, but the energy that could be negative in the room. The second thing that I brought to that conversation, which really, really helped it, genuine curiosity. I think product managers really need to care about their customers. And I really was fascinated to know everything. So I dug into listening to what the police wanted. I tried to understand how they were approaching what they did every day. Obviously, I can't talk about it on this talk, but they were wanting to collaborate and they were wanting to take part in the conversation. And so by the end of 45 minutes, we'd actually started to really unpick, and I'd sort of figured out what I thought were 3 pain points, 3 jobs to be done. And so that's where we got to in step 2. So it was very clear that they can't be everywhere all at once. There's a problem where they want people to be reassured, and they know that if they are seen, that really helps. So they have a problem with awareness. The second thing is that they really want to connect with people, and they want to earn their respect. And what that means is they want to be trusted, right? And it's really hard if you don't know who someone is to trust them. And that comes to our third problem, which is that they really need intelligence. They need intel, and they believe in collaboration. One of the biggest things, just as a person that works, that I took from this is I've never seen a company, the police, I've never been in a place where the people that work there care so much about their customers, about the people they serve. And they do it incredibly humbly. They want to collaborate. They know that it's a thing they want to do with you. Which is incredible. I came back to the business, I was like, everyone, we need to run our company like the police. This is amazing. Let me tell you about it. But they had a problem, right? If they have problem 1 and they have problem 2, people don't know the police and people don't trust the police as much. They're not going to really talk to them. And so they couldn't really collaborate. And so there were 3 really clear jobs to be done here that you can see sit across sort of functional, social, and emotional in some regards, that they were wanting help with. Now, we'd already started thinking about what could maybe we do with the police with a hyperlocal social network. So we had some frameworks of feasibility from a technical point of view, but we didn't know exactly what to do. It was enough that I could then effectively conduct a solution interview. So by having 45 minutes with the police, we were then able to have a bit more time where I essentially said, well, how about this? Why don't we build you kind of pop-up private rooms? You can speak to people about it and you can raise your profile. And it was really important to know here that the police have problem 1, right? They can't be everywhere all the time. It's not that they can spend 24/7 on a social network. They want to be out catching the bad guys. So saying that they could just have a room that's there for them to talk to and that it would disappear later and they can have lots of them was really appealing. So I found something that could tie to their needs. On top of this, we could do it anytime they wanted it, and we could do it any geolocal reference. So we could make it, if there was a problem here, they could just talk to those people. They want to broadcast, they could have a big chat. It really empowered them to start having a conversation they can't really have any other way. So they were really compelled and like, well, let's try it. This is really valuable. We're willing to invest and see if this product works. And I was like, yeah, of course, it all works. It's fantastic. I'll be in touch. Which then obviously comes to part 3. So having conducted a very good part 2, we now need to figure out how to ship a super secure MVP to validate that our value proposition actually does work. Because obviously we serve the users that live in the homes, and we now work with the police. So obviously I run back to the business and I'm like, guys, it's fantastic. We're effectively going to build a web-based version of the product. And I think what we need to do is like expiring links. It's like Zoom, but for Messenger. And the police want to start next week. So obviously the tech team was essentially going, what? 5 days? 7 days? I mean, we got to about 8 days, but like, and that's why they don't normally let me out, right? But then we got to looking at what would be possible. We took the minimum that would be needed and made it super secure, and we were able to ship a product, right? It was a first product. And what this meant is that the police, who obviously are not tech savvy and also need things to be very secure, were able to receive very simple encrypted links with a button. They tap it, it would open up a screen. They could not see the rest of the network. And they were able to open into a chat window. They could be inside a squad car. They could be in the office. They could be anywhere, and they could just start talking to people. And we started building out something that could have a connection. So we were trying to solve their 3 problems. And what was really great here is that it also had a meaningful impact because, again, whilst I can't tell you the details, like they did catch some of the bad guys, but not just some of the bad guys. They actually caught one of the big bad guys. Like literally, the community working with the police was able to give them everything they needed to be able to have an incredible way of serving. So everyone saw an impact, and in the company, obviously, we were really happy we were able to contribute something because it's what we really wanted. And attached to that, it also had an impact for us because these were the kinds of numbers we then started to see. So what you have here are unique cohorts over weeks going down, and then across the weeks of engagement. As you can see, that 10% number was obliterated. Now, it wasn't just doing it with the police, but what this did is it taught us the way that we could build very rapid features that enabled, let's call it points of authority or points of interest to collaborate together that didn't really have a voice. So we were able to very quickly test and experiment something in obviously a very safe and secure and right for the police way, but very, very fast to make sure it works. So at this point, I think that I know this is very startup focused, but I think there's a lot that can be applied here from my first public sector experience that can go into any product team. And so I'll just kind of go through those today. So the first thing is that from my humble opinion, I think that product people are unstoppable. You are the most impactful people in any business. You have more power than anything else. Dependent on many other things, you work collaboratively. But when product people set themselves unrealistic targets, I think they can achieve incredible things. And what's important here is they set themselves targets. That does not you go to your boss and you say, I'd like to set an unrealistic target for myself. Is that okay? That's not the idea. That does not work well. But not telling anyone, writing it down, folding it, putting it in a piece of paper and just hiding it in a drawer. I think setting those kinds of spaces to think help product people to leap forward in the ways that they want to have impacts because they're less limited by everything else that can't necessarily think as a product person does. So that's the first thing. And genuinely, 30 days is the time. It's always possible within 30 days. The second thing is that you should look to try and have conversations and persevere, not just to do little iterative things, but to look for what matters most, right? And in this case, you saw someone doing something what I would call irrational. The police were willing to go forward and do it straight away. And the reason for this is that whilst it seems like an irrational behavior, it's a lot of different behavior from what they're used to. The value it creates is that much, right? Normally you act based on the amount of pain or the amount of pleasure you're going to receive when it comes to customer type behaviors. So if you're constantly chipping away at something, it's fine, right? That's the business as usual of product. But persevering to find those real things, those really big problems that cause people to do irrational actions, and you can see them when you talk to them and you find one, these are the things that I think fundamentally iterate products. And good product managers are always looking for those outside of everything else we have to do. Which brings us to the last point, which is that I believe that small teams will always be able to achieve these sorts of things. They are always going to be able to move faster than bigger teams because they run together as a nucleus. And what that means is that a team of between 5 and 7 people, they can work really quickly and they can have a meeting and everyone's in that meeting and then they can actually do the work. They don't even have to leave the room, whether it's virtual or physical. and they can even get to the next one, right? It's very progressive and quick. If you do this in a big team or you're doing a big project, then you miss what's called a bias for action, right? You can't work together because you're doing two other things. If you're doing it with enough people, you have a bias for inclusion, or you have a bias for approval. And obviously a bias for approval is about getting everyone to buy into it, politics, etc. And then bias for inclusion is making sure that everyone comes along on the journey. These are important things. I think there's a difference between doing something right and doing something fast. And great product people know when to do these in different measures. In our case, we had to do something fast. I can tell you that after this, we did something right. The work we built around this product was rock solid. It was incredibly high level encryption. It was wonderful and really collaborated with multiple parties and worked seamlessly with them. But you have to earn the right to write. You have to do the bias for doing things quickly first. So I think those three things can be demonstrated in this, but I think that they're key to all product pieces, right? Being agile, working in a fashion where you do time boxing and being customer focused, as these 3 bullet points are, is another way to say it, but I think they're less product centric. So hopefully you can take those forward and think about how you can use those tomorrow. So that was my story. I hope it was reasonably interesting. Maybe you learned something, maybe you found it amusing. But above all, thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to the Q&A later.
Thanks, James. I definitely found it entertaining and giggled on more than one occasion. So thank you for giving me the dose of laughter that was very much needed today. Moving on, we have, last but not least, we have Joe. Joe has led a number of product teams at News UK, Microsoft, the BBC, and Babylon Health. She was born and raised in Australia and started her career as an aerospace engineer, moving to the UK in 1998. In 2000, she got into tech, joining MSN during the first dot-com bubble. And in her last role as the VP of product at Zoopla, Joe led teams driving enterprise growth and radically improving the consumer and customer experiences of the entire property lifecycle. Joe today will talk about her first pitch to a billionaire. After more than 20 years in her career, this was still a first for her. And more than ever, it was very critical for her to understand the audience, nail the narrative, and to expect the unexpected. Joe, stage is all yours.
Thanks, Lena. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here, wrapping things up for the day. So I hope you've all survived and looking forward to a bit of cool air coming through tomorrow. I certainly am. So yeah, as Alina mentioned, I've been doing versions of product for quite some time, and during my 20 years plus as a product manager, I've done quite a lot of presentations and pitches. I've presented to audiences like this one, like-minded product managers looking for tips and tricks that can help us do our jobs better. I presented at company town halls, perhaps trying to explain something really technical or intangible to a non-technical audience. And many times I've been presenting to senior execs about the progress of my product portfolio, or maybe to pitch new ideas for investment. Many times, whilst doing that, I've never had the experience until just in the last 12 months when I got to present, very unique for me, to present for investment to a billionaire. And I thought you might find the nuances of that particular experience interesting. So when starting to prepare any presentation, one of your first steps is to understand who you're going to be presenting to. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's the charm model for storytelling, and I'm going to use it a few times today. Storytelling is possibly, I think, the most important skill for a product manager. Our main job is to help teams decide what they should be working on next and why. We have to be able to explain the what and the why to many, many different stakeholder groups. Everything is written in pencil. And this really speaks to being more adaptable. Nothing is set in stone. And as the environment around you changes, and it has for his company, he and his company demonstrated that they were really able to adapt quickly and change as necessary and adapt to the way that the environment was changing. running up escalators, whilst sounding ridiculously challenging to me, reflects a sense of urgency and a bias for action. James was talking about debt, and they worked for years to repay their investors before selling off their business. But he and his co-founder then took those lessons that they learned from and moved them in and took those forward into their next business, which is now more than 20 years old, almost 20 years old. The growth of his current business has come from a relentless focus on a core set of digital marketing skills that they've developed over the year, one of the biggest and most valuable digital media companies in the world. And in less than 20 years, he's grown his company to encompass 30 brands, 4,500 employees, 10 cities around the world, and in 3 continents. So pretty daunting. And an incredible, unique near-death experience that he has spoken about in public, and it's given him clearly a desire to give back and leave the world in a better place. It has changed the way that he's done business and things since then. And since that event, he has gone on to set up a nonprofit to help underserved kids in the US. It's going to be tricky to stand out from 30 different brands and 4,500 employees. So really important that I hit the right altitude. This billionaire is spending typically one day in each city as he travels for business reviews with his different companies. So what will we do? What can I do to help us stand out? He's not going to remember a lot of details, so I have to hit the right altitude. And finally, be human. I know he cares. He cares about the why. He cares not just for the customer, but for the broader impact of the organization. And I have to say, are we making the world a better place? Can we demonstrate that? So my next step is to prepare the content. And now I think I know a bit about what makes this guy tick. How do I pick out the right notes to emphasize in my story? Given what I know about the billionaire, progress over perfection, and the need to stand out, my need to stand out and hit the right altitude, it's clear that my narrative needs to be concise and memorable. As I said, he has 30 brands in his company and is visiting a different company on each day. He's not going to have the bandwidth to listen to a lot of detail. So this meeting has been scheduled to give an update on the new proposition called My Home that we had launched just 3 months earlier. For the progress report section, I leveraged that great storytelling technique of the power of 3. We structured our roadmap. Grow, monetize became the anchor I use throughout the progress report in this update and in previous exec updates. It's really simple and easy to digest, and I leverage things like data, graphics, and really simple bullet points to illustrate the progress against our metrics. I mean, remember, a picture is of code we were shipping. We were shipping in hundreds of code releases a month and doing many experiments. I talked about which of those experiments failed and, most importantly, what we'd learned from those failures so that we could take into our future concepts. Transparency and vulnerability were really important to show that we had a capacity to learn and that we were, really experimenting to try and validate our concepts as quickly as possible. And as I moved into the end game of the presentation, I knew it was really important to shift gears. The progress report had been good. It was clear and simple, and it leveraged bullet points and graphs and success metrics. It was concise and memorable, but it was a bit dry. So if I wanted our chairman to invest, I had to bring the product vision to life. I needed to personalize the narrative. This was the bit where getting the emotional response really matters. I wanted to share my own experience in a way that triggered a connection, empathy, and curiosity in our chairman. I wanted him to feel my pain in the process, and then the delight that I was going to feel when our product vision would solve the problems that I have. House, a place where our then 6-year-old son could have some outdoor space. Ideally, we wanted to be close to a park where we could take him to play and meet with his friends. And we'd been searching for months. As this was our first house, we were very tight on a budget. actually, we wanted to call up the estate agent and try and get an appointment for a viewing, and they'd already taken it off the market. So with our budget, we were looking at fixer-uppers, dumps, right? So that we could afford a whole home. It was really important, therefore, to me to understand whether every time we found a potential home, I would go to the local council website, I'd search through planning permissions, I'd need to figure out which of those planning permissions were for a home that was similar to the one that we were considering. And what kind of work that could I do? Could I do a loft? Could I do a kitchen extension? It wasn't always the same. So you can imagine, frustratingly, by the time I had done all of this research, the home that I was considering purchasing would already have an offer from someone else, and it was off the market. So it was time consuming, but often it was heartbreaking. So imagine if I was searching through homes for sale on the web, and when I was looking at those homes, those listings, I could find all the relevant willing to pay for. So that was my narrative, and I'm pleased to say, well, it was part of the narrative. There was a lot more of it, but I'm pleased to say that it managed to have the impact I wanted. So much so that another more board member.
Thanks, Joe. That was super insightful. I'll just bring in everybody else and we can jump into a quick Q&A. Perfect. Let me just remove the slides. Okay, let's go. I have a couple of questions to kick it off. So the first one would be to James.
It's literally what's possible within the time. And then you normally have fast follows. So you'll have a plan for 8 days and a plan for, say, 30 days. And you can work back from that. Normally, it's the amount of resources you can throw at something in 8 days that helps solve this problem. I would normally say that the minimum is normally quite intuitive for people. And it actually becomes much easier. The 30-day one is much harder because you're deciding how you get everything else done you've promised.
How about ML, Claire? Is that different?
So I was mostly walking and going, I'm going to riff it, if I'm being honest with you. But we knew the fundamental things we had to learn, right? So it was more about going pain points and goals, and then identifying and empathizing with the person.
I think the most important thing is to be honest with your tech team. They can spot it a mile away if you're blagging it. So just be honest. And actually, I think machine learning people in particular, they're so used to people blagging it that they really appreciate it when someone says, hang on a minute, I don't understand this thing. Is it like this? And help them understand what level to pitch your knowledge at, because that you can really end up deep diving into these topics. So you have to help them understand, okay, I want to understand it at this level of abstraction, and use your customer interviewing skills essentially on your tech team to guide where you want that conversation to go in terms of what you want to find out. But people generally, ML people love geeking out, so they're a friendly bunch.
You also mentioned that it's quite important not to over-engineer. So I guess question for all of you, when you're building products, how do you know that you're over-engineering? And how do you know how to strip it back and how to go back to the basics of simplicity?
If that question is to me first, then there's a theory called Occam's razor, basically the simplest thing first. So you should always be, if you're trying to develop a particular outcome, you should be always probing your tech team to see, can I do this more simply? And then as a PM, if you're starting to get dragged into the technical side of it and you become really passionate about the solution and your blinkers are on, try and take the signal of how many external stakeholders are going, are you sure? Can we put this into people's hands yet? As a signal of, maybe you need to just take a step back and understand if you're getting a bit too deeply involved or whether you're actually protecting the standard of the product.
Joe, do you want to go next?
I think probably I've come across these issues many times, and it can be really difficult. I I had a lot of challenges with some of the team members in the product team, actually, previously, where they really wanted to use a specific technology. In this case, it was to use ID verification to verify a user, to enable them to basically edit some data on our site. And they wanted to go for a tech solution for that. And I really pushed back that I felt we could validate whether we needed to go down that route of validation at all, if the data was that sensitive that we needed to do that. And I wanted to push them to take a more risky approach that was much more quick and dirty to actually validate the problem first. And I do think that quite often, and what I'm trying to say here, it's not always from the engineering team, it's quite often from product teams, from design, other parts of the organization, that there's a cool bit of tech that somebody wants to make use of, and actually what's the problem we're trying to solve, which I think we've all spoken to, is can you validate that you can solve that problem before actually going down a more heavy way of solving it through technology. Might get to that eventually, but it's really important to try and test it first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that really resonates with what I was going to say, Joe. So I'll just add a piece, I guess. I would probably look at it through 3 lenses. So we can take the startup lens, let's say less than 500 people, the startup lens, let's say 3,500 people, and the big tech lens, so 25,000 person people. And I think with the little startup, it's really, really easy because they're normally so addicted to building value that they get really upset if they're just doing stuff and grinding. Actually, to get them to do bigger things is normally quite challenging. So actually just having the respect of your tech team, there will be enough engineers, even if there's 5 or 15 of them, that there'll be a bias for action, and they'll be like, I'm not doing it. How is it valuable? They don't normally get too excited about techie stuff unless you end up in a very deep tech type company. Or if you're doing primitives, Web3 type stuff. But let's just take that as an exception. Most startups, we're good. In 3,500 people, normally you have large product organizations. And I would say that the biggest challenge you have in that one is probably politics. So the way that you stop the scoping or the scaling out is just trying to figure out who's going to try and, as Joe said, lump stuff in because I need it for my P&L or it's related to what I'm trying to achieve, which is not helpful whatsoever to what we're trying to do quickly. And that's how you stop it. So it's not even, in my opinion, the engineers in that size of company, it's everyone else that messes it up. And then in the 25,000 person company, you have a slightly different problem in my experience, because you have this really annoying integration issue, which is that you want to do fun, smart stuff, but there's like 5 companies that were M&A'd in, and then this other company, and then there's this legacy system that only works in Chrome 1, and da-da-da-da-da. And so actually your MVP has to exist in an environment that plays nice with that. And I would arguably say that your MVP, or trying to keep your scope down, starts with what can I ship in the infrastructure I live in quickly? And then what's the product I want to do that's valuable? And it sounds horrible to say that, but if a product team wants to move fast, you have to learn in which environment you work in to then like dodge the thing that will make it massive when it shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That all makes sense. And all of those situations kind of ring a bell a little bit. And just to round off our Q&A, I think we've all been in situations where you might have deliverables and timelines that kind of seem impossible at the time, such as an MVP in 5 days. So what would be your practical advice to rally people around it and motivate? Because it probably is one of the most important things that contributes towards the success of actually getting it done on time.
I can go first. So I think, how can you get people to do those kinds of activities? I think that, again, I'll put just 2 lenses. I think in the smaller world, they kind of buy into it, and culturally your organization is going to be filled with people that like doing this. So hopefully you've attracted the right people. So the answer to the question would be a talent challenge, I think, which is that you've got enough commandos that are going to go crazy, whether they're tech, product, pick a name, and move at that pace consistently, because that's why they're there. And then when you actually slow down, they'll leave, which is fine. In the opposite spectrum, I think that you probably need to make bets. If you're a product person trying to compel people, I kind of look at it in like, you can either do peacetime, wartime, if you like that kind of stuff, or you can just say high burn. Like, I don't think that in other more established organizations that don't have that defined culture, and some massive companies have that culture, but they normally don't have the best reputation for culture. you kind of will sit them down and say, here's a thing that I think is going to be massive. We should go high burn, and you never do it for more than, so say, 30 days. 5 days would be great, but it probably has to be 30 days because there's stuff. And then you just say, we will see what happens. The way that I've normally compelled people to this, when I go into, say, a large organization, I'm helping them out with it, is to say, I'll do you a deal. Let's smash it. Let's go for this. And we'll measure it. And I promise, because I know you've cut the corners, I promise if it doesn't work, we'll take it out. If it works, we'll do it right. And actually, normally that creates a lot of conviction because people know they're going to go for it, but they also know that they're not inheriting all the trash if it doesn't work out, which is the big thing they normally worry about rather than having fun with it. It's like, oh my goodness, now we have to support 10 of these. Thanks, James. So having a promise with them that it'll either stay and we'll make good or we'll cut it out, I find helps, but you do need to give a little bit of time to figure that out. So like 30 days on, 30 days off, or if you like 1 month in 3, you go high burn.
Mm-hmm.
I will probably come at a slightly different angle in that very often we'll have fixed deadlines in our world, particularly in an established company that has maybe a marketing campaign that's coming up with television that's booked. And those things are booked months in advance. So you're investing a lot of money on a above the line advertising, and you want hopefully some of your core features to be ready. Now, I think the challenge there is that the TV is booked, but the product isn't yet defined really. So I do think that is I love having a constraint. I think there's so much research on the power of constraints. It forces teams to get creative, and we had to somehow figure out how to do a rebrand in a couple of months across a legacy site which had no consistent design across it and different technologies, and we did it because we got creative and we had an engineer and pulled together a few apprentices, and they went off and came up with a creative way of achieving a good enough outcome for the campaign. So I think I love fixed dates, and I know that it's sometimes not very agile, but actually I think it forces you to be more agile when you have some notion of a fixed date that you need to work back from, because it gets everyone to be really creative on what are the absolute must-haves and how do you get there. So I do quite like that.
Claire, anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. So I guess from a machine learning perspective, or first from a general PM perspective, if you're being requested to act on such a tight deadline, particularly if you're a PM embedded in the team, there's a lot of team trust that you're going to burn up if you commit to that first. So I think firstly, as a PM, you need to understand, is that realistic? So I would probably go through, we talked about 5 days just then. I would only spend a couple of days trying to understand if that was realistic before pushing back very hard if I didn't think it was, because you need to protect your team from failed deadlines, because that's really demoralizing. And then I really love what the others were saying about the value of a deadline. I think coming from a machine learning kind of centered product, depending on the criticality of the decision making, if it's not good enough, it's not good enough. And so you have to be prepared when you're working with these particular things to say, we're going to work to the deadline, but you also need to know in your mind, when am I going to make that decision of whether I think it's actually going to be performant? Because with some of these solutions, you can't really fudge around the edges for that long. I mean, you might be able to have humans working in the background. We've heard stories of that before when something's meant to be machine learning and it's not. But ultimately, you need to be really confident that you are going to be able to ship performance very quickly if you're working to that deadline. And that's something that you as an MLPM really need to be on top of.
I love it. Thank you, everyone. It was great that we always, every single question, we had so different perspectives and angles. And I think on this note, we can conclude our evening. Thank you to Claire and James and Joe for joining us today. And thank you for our viewers, and have a good evening. And hopefully tomorrow we see some rain.